Hello everyone, I hope you're all doing great today. I've added some new stories that I really liked into this video today, so I really hope you enjoy them. There's something about forest and wood stories and snow ones that I really like, so I've made sure to incorporate that into this today, so I hope you will enjoy it. As always, there's a message before the video starts, so if you want to go straight to the stories, then there's timestamps in the description below. Make sure you check out my Instagram at Joe the Insomniac and the podcast in the description below. So for today I'd like to share this. That's to try and view life differently if you're struggling with issues. It might seem like the whole of your life is against you, and you might have felt very alone or feel it now, but realize this. It makes you understand that you're actually okay on your own. You've gained a really good tool here, and you might not have looked at it that way before. If you're on your own like that, or have been before, it shows you know that you're still fine. You're still living and still breathing. If it happens again, you'll be able to handle it. I know for me, that was something I used to struggle a lot with, but when I started to view it that way and realize that I'm okay on my own, and I've realized it was a real good strength I actually had, I really started to appreciate it. And instead of looking at my messed up past, not things that I had done, more so things that had happened, as the perfect training ground for life, it completely changed the way I was thinking. And also, you might feel a bit overwhelmed with things you have to do, but sometimes I find if I slow my thoughts down and calm myself down and listen to a song I like and start slowly getting on with a list of things I need to do for the day, I'll feel a lot better and feel a lot more accomplished at the end of it. So I think that can make a big difference. And also, as somebody who has OCD, I've realised that if you aren't exactly sure what you have or how to deal with it, it can be quite frustrating and tiring. But the way I found I could actually break out of the cognitions was by, well, for me at the time, I'd think if I didn't touch things a certain number of times, then something bad would happen, and I'd have weird negative thoughts associated with patterns. But I realised I would just do it and see if the bad thing would happen, and it never would, and that really helped me break out from my OCD. And for those of you that think you might have it but don't, it normally causes excessive worrying and obsessions over patterns, colouring, and odd and even numbers. So if you have that, you might have OCD, and it might be worth checking it out. Again, that was something else that therapy really helped me with. Don't be scared to go to therapy, it can change your life. I know it did for me. And don't worry too if you don't necessarily get with the right therapist immediately, because I got with some okay one at first and a couple of others, but I eventually found a really good one and it really changed my life. And you have to trust that these people understand your condition better than you. You always know yourself better than anyone, but they'll understand your condition better than you ever could unless you'd actually studied it directly in terms of knowing how to help it. Because oftentimes we'll try and deal with certain mental illnesses in our head through the way that seems to be right, but I know from my own experience I was dealing with them completely wrong and making everything far worse. For example, where I would isolate myself, or my social anxiety where I would hide away from things I didn't want to do, I thought they were helping it because I wasn't being exposed to what was making me feel pain, but realistically it was the opposite. And I only learnt that through my therapist, and it completely changed my life. So I really hope that can make a difference for people who need to hear it out there. So yeah, I hope you're doing great. I love you, and remember that you're not alone in your struggles. Even if it's only me you know of out there who struggles or has struggled a lot the same as you, then remember that you're not alone. But you can see in the comments and everywhere around, maybe not today, but you'll realise there's others like you too, and it does get better. Okay, so I hope you enjoy these stories. Take care and have a great day. I live in part of Alaska where there's nothing but woods all around. I'm the only person who lives in these woods for about 20.5 miles all around, so visitors are always a rare and special event. This time though, it was a creepy event. I decided to go camping in the woods about 5 miles away from my cabin because I'm stressed out that week I need to get away from everything. I found a nice clearing and set up the camp before nightfall. The woods aren't very quiet. There's always birds chirping, rustling of leaves, and bunnies and deers running about. It was about 7 PM when the first incident happened. I was listening to the wilderness outside of my tent while the fire is dying just outside. I placed my pack up into a tree and had my 12 gauge unloaded to my right. All of a sudden, all noises in the area stop. Now, I then heard what sounded like snow crunch. I thought it was a deer. The only real predators in that area that I'd actually known about were bears, but this was too heavy to be a deer or a bear. It was circling my camp now. All I could hear was snow crunching underneath what sounds like two-legged animals moving, slowly getting closer. This actually goes on for hours. I had my 12 gauge ready, but only remembered it wasn't loaded until the animal was about 7 feet away from my tent. I grabbed my box of buckshot, put the first shell in, click, the footsteps stop, click, click, click. I kept straining to hear anything, but sound never came. I fell asleep for a few hours, but woke up at around 2 AM. My tent was open. I saw my shotgun right outside of the tent. I felt like I'm being watched. All I could see were stars in the pitch black nothingness. But 2 stars moved. I didn't know how to react. The 2 stars that moved were now circling closer. I realized their eyes. The animal had to have been about 9 feet tall, and it kept coming. I could smell it now. It smells like rotten meat and death. My shotgun was only a foot away from my hand, and I carefully grab it. I pray it's still loaded, and that thing hasn't unloaded it. I pumped the shell into the chamber and took my shot. The light was blinding in the darkness, but what the flash illuminated still makes everything worse. It was hairy. Too hairy to be a man, and too long to be a bear. Its feet were gigantic and darkish. The face had no hair but was the same colour as my feet. The eyes were huge and were looking right at me. The mouth is open with big yellow teeth. The arms are long and hairy, just like the legs. It's maybe just below 9 feet tall. After the shot, I heard a scream that shook the tent to the ground. I hit the animal. I hear it running off into the wilderness screaming. I started packing right away in the pitch black. I look up at the stars. None of them have moved. Now, as I was leaving the clearing in which I made my camp at, I looked back and saw those huge eyes again shining in the darkness, looking towards me. I ran through the woods, unsure where I was going this time. I could hear crunches behind me. I looked back and the eyes are just in the distance. I saw the lights of my house through the woods. I could still hear the snapping, but it was further behind me now. I made it home and locked my door. The paranoia almost makes me pass out. I felt like I'm being watched. I have all the curtains closed though. The only window without curtains or blinds is a small one that's above the kitchen sink. I was in my living room alone for an hour. Now it's 5:30 AM and the sun will be rising soon. I looked around the house, still paranoid. I saw the window above the sink in the kitchen, but there's nothing there. I felt relieved for a few seconds, until the eyes moved into place there, looking right at me. We made eye contact, and I saw the first rays of sunlight coming through the window. The animal grunted and stomped back into the forest, shaking the ground as the cabin moved. I don't see it often anymore. Sometimes it shows up, eyes peering through the darkness at me. I feel that we've come to an agreement. I stay away from the woods at night and I don't get eaten. If anything happens from here, I'll keep everybody updated. So this didn't happen to only me, but my uncle too. I must clarify this. This was after Christmas Eve, and we went to a party. Everyone went home. I decided to stay because my cousin and I are watching a movie. My uncle, who used to walk his dogs in the woods next to a park, went to take them out. Before this, my aunt told him that you shouldn't do this because it's too dark out there, literally 5 a.m. He didn't care. He went off anyway. My auntie was still worried, so I went along with him. Now nothing seems too off so far, just it's really quiet here. So, my uncle and his dogs are usually having a relaxing walk. Now I'm not really paying much attention to the surroundings when suddenly, the dog goes still. This isn't strange, they always stop and have a look at things around them. But, my uncle and I notice that something isn't right. The dogs weren't angry or curious, just anxious and afraid. The largest one was actually shaking and growling. Now it's not even a confident growl, almost I don't know what's gonna happen kind of growl. As my uncle started to get worried about the situation, we hear it. People in the woods. We didn't know how many we saw because of how dark it is, but we can hear them saying, "We all gather by the blood of we, thee and thy." As my uncle and I heard that, he yelled for his dogs to follow him in a hushed tone. We quickly get out of the woods. We look back and see some movement in the branches off to the shrubs. These people are trying to hide and watch us now. After all that has happened, he hasn't walked his dogs near the woods or in darkness ever again. My sister and I were sleeping in bunk beds at my parents' cabin on Lake Superior when we were in our early 20s. There wasn't anyone out there except for us. It was late in the fall and pretty cold. It's so remote and pitch black. Around 1 a.m, my sister and I both wake up because we can hear someone playing the flute right outside of our window down a half-mile long driveway in the middle of the woods. We were silent there for about 30 seconds. We both started asking each other if we're hearing the same thing. It stopped after about 30 more seconds, and suddenly, we look around through the woods and don't see anything. As someone who has grown up on an infamous haunted plantation, I've never actually been scared of ghosts. Curious and intrigued, yes. Scared? Never. In fact, I've gone through a lot of trouble just to go to a haunted house or location. I lived in Virginia, so there's lots of places to go to up in the forests. There has only been one incident that scared me so bad I'll never ghost hunt again. When this particular event happened, I was 19, and me and my boyfriend were exploring. We made it a thing to go around at midnight to go ghost hunting at random places. He lived in Williamsburg, VA, so there were lots of places to go. We would go around the Newport area as well. Some famous places that we visited often were Old Housewoods, Crawford Road, Roswell House, etc. One night we decided we're bored and we wanted to go out with a group of friends and do ghost hunting. We got 3 of our friends on board and get ready to head out for the night. We usually make sure we're nice and toasty when we get to our destination, stand in the warm for a while before. We decided to check out Roswell. Then on our way back home, we're going to take a detour through Crawford Road. The night started out really fun. We basically couldn't stop laughing the entire night. One of my friends, on the other hand, couldn't shake this bad feeling. He insisted that we go home or get some food at a fast food place. He was also insisting that we skip Crawford Road because it was too out of the way from their apartment complex. I was very insistent that we checked out Crawford Road. Since my boyfriend was driving, it didn't matter. We jumped back in the car, get some McDonald's and head over to Crawford. Crawford Bridge is just this little bridge on a very desolate, creepy road. If I remember correctly, the road's about 10 miles long. The bridge was where they would go to hang people, and ghost sightings are common. So we got on Crawford Road. We decided that we could get out of the car to take a better look. Now I remind you, it's about 1:30 AM. I'm not scared, but get scared of the idea of what happened here previously. At the time I thought my friend being scared all of a sudden was strange, because he usually loved doing this stuff. He kept on saying he had a bad feeling. He had a bad feeling and that he always trusts his gut. Now we should have listened, but we're all too stubborn, and are almost on the bridge. Right as we come around the corner to the bridge, we see a car just park on the side of the road. As we get a little closer to the car came on the same side of the road as us. We assumed it's some teenagers checking out the landmark like we were, but as we're about to pass them, I see the outline of two older men. I did see that they were both bald, sending chills down my spine, so I tell my boyfriend keep on driving. He agreed that we shouldn't get out or stop. So we passed slowly, but when we were about to turn the corner to the bridge to be out of view, I saw that the car slowly turned around, turns on his high beams and starts following us. At first, we're a little freaked out, but you know, coincidences happen. About 2 miles down the road, the car's right on our tail. We decide to go faster than normal to lose him. The speed limit on the road was 30 to 40 miles an hour. We're going 65 just to try and shake the car. The whole time the car was so close to ours, it's almost touching. At this point, we're all officially freaked out. My friend, who was originally freaking out, was now in tears. We officially were being chased by these guys. I felt a lot of relief when I saw that there's a turn onto a highway ahead. There are almost no cars on the road, so we didn't even stop at the stop sign. We ran right through it, and so does a car behind us. We saw a 711 up ahead, and we thought if we turn into it, that they would just keep going and leave us alone. But no. They decide to follow us right into the 711 parking lot. We would be the only ones in the parking lot together, and at the time, I didn't think any of us wanted to come face to face with the mysterious bald man. My boyfriend then unexpectedly punched it out of the parking lot, follows the mysterious car. At this point, we're all honestly thinking we're about to die. We had no idea what the intentions were of these people, but we knew obviously it's not good, and we've been specifically targeted. Once we got on the road, we're going at easily 100. We're all screaming, and I managed to call the police, but I was in hysterics going 100 miles an hour in an area I'm not used to. At some point, the car got from behind us and into the other lane. I look over, thought I saw a flash of something metallic coming up in their window. Then suddenly my boyfriend slams on the brakes. The other car keeps going 100 as we quickly turn around. When I look back, I see them doing the same thing. But by the time that they've turned around, we're already flying in the opposite direction. Somehow, I'm not sure how, but we lost them. We try and find the most populated area that we could. Once we found a random apartment complex, we stopped the car and are all crying. My friend who told us we shouldn't go yelling at us. He's going on about how you need to trust your instincts. Let me tell you, I've never not trusted them since. This happened 10 plus years ago, so I'm paraphrasing for all parties. Now, it's not the creepiest story, but unsettling to say the least. My dad and I were hiking on this mountain trail that was super steep and treacherous. No exaggeration, at some points I was legitimately worried I'd fall to my death if I even took the wrong step. It wasn't a super long hike, but super challenging one. Eventually we made it to the top. We had brought food with us, so we sat down and started snacking. Maybe 10 minutes later, this guy comes out of this bush. A lone bush. He literally came out. So obvious he was hiding there. Let me just say, I'm not trying to sound rude, but this guy was huge. An unhealthily large man. My first thought was, how did that guy make it up here? Again, not trying to be rude. I was genuinely curious as to how he made it up here. I was out of breath, and so was my dad. The guy was not, though. Interaction goes like this. Guys, hey, can I sit with you guys? Before we could answer, he sat down on the rock next to us and starts talking. He was asking the most cliche creepy questions like, where do you guys live? How old are you? Are you married? Now, I was 13 at the time, and you're pretty. My dad immediately stands up, gives me a head nod like move behind him or away from him, tells the guy he wants to spend some time with his daughter. My dad was super polite, but I could tell he was thrown off. We start moving our area, and the guy says, hey, screw you, aggressively towards my dad. My dad says something along the lines of, watch your mouth, my kid's here. We did have a rifle on us, but that didn't seem to register to the guy. He definitely saw it though. It's on my dad's back. The guy just sat there on the rock and would not go away. He was staring us down. In his defense, there wasn't really anywhere for him to go except back into the bush or down the mountain. He kept staring. He honestly gave me the most uneasy feeling. This situation was classic horror movie stuff. My first thought is that he was mentally disabled in some way, or mentally disturbed, and was probably harmless. But after we moved, he started threatening us, saying stuff like, I'll beat the crap out of you, you won't speak to me like that. That's when alarms really start going off. The situation escalates pretty quickly thereafter, so my dad takes a rifle off his back and whispers to me to stand up and walk down the mountain. He'll be right behind me. The next part is from hearing movement and footsteps because I was following my dad's order, but I could hear the guy starting after my dad, asking why were they leaving. My dad turns around and screams at him to back off. I hear the click from the safety and thought, is this seriously happening now? He wasn't trying to be bad, the gun was for bears, but the guy eventually backs off. My dad called up to me and said everything's fine and just keep going. We made it back to the car, locked the doors and drove out of there fast. To this day, I don't know how he got up there. People hunt on the other parts of the mountain and hike there during the appropriate seasons. You cannot legally live there. God knows how long he'd been there and what his intentions were. I'm just glad that my dad had a rifle. That guy was really like a bear. My friends and I decided to take my girlfriend at the time to see this beautiful nature area, deciding to go to a national park about an hour and a half away from where I actually lived. This place is definitely no sort of secret location. It's very well known, but there's a ton of different areas to it, all with different rural and windy roads taking you to various areas of the park. We had gone in 2 different cars. We'd finished out by a day of hiking and were heading down to one of the less common roads. Now I remembered seeing this really beaten up 70s sedan with a wild looking dude in the driver's seat driving past us in the opposite direction. This isn't uncommon as there's a lot of smaller, less economically sound towns scattered around the area, but for some reason his car stood out. My girlfriend notices it as well. About 200 meters further down the windy road, there's a pull-off area. There was a camper van belonging to a company that mostly rented out colourful vans to backpackers parked there with a woman standing in front of it. As soon as she sees us, she jumps out to the road and flags us down. Now I've read enough of these to know what to do, and know that pulling in might not be the safest idea. Though I ignore this and decide to pull over, knowing my friends are behind. Luckily she wasn't the person I didn't want to meet. She was quite obviously upset and scared when I pull in. I told my girlfriend to wait in the car, and I got out to speak to her. She's almost in tears. I can't remember where she was from, but a Central European country from memory. Touring around with her 4 or 5-year-old daughter, she told me her van had broken down, and she had pulled over there and called the van company's assistant line for help. By this time my friends had pulled up behind us to see what's up. Apparently a weird man had been driving past her a few times, first pulling over to offer to take her and her daughter to the nearest town for help, but thanking him and saying no, that she's waiting for assistance. He left, but then he kept driving past her every 10 or 15 minutes in the opposite direction, slowing down, looking at them driving off. She begged us to stay with her while we waited for the assistant vehicle. The guy terrified them. I agreed. My friends, being the awesome people they are, decided to take me and my girlfriend and ditch us. Thanks guys. We wait with this woman for a little while before the car and my girlfriend I'd seen earlier drove past, kind of slowing down in the opposite direction. As soon as he'd driven around the corner, the lady says that's him, and he's been here so many times before. This got my girlfriend and I to take her much more seriously now, as we got the same feeling from that guy. A few moments later he came back from the opposite direction and pulls into the parking lot. For some context, I'm not an intimidating man. I'm tallish, but I have almost zero muscle and soft features, so there's not at all intimidating features on me. There's a terrified foreign woman, her daughter, and my girlfriend. So parked off in a quiet, secluded rural location, and there's some creepy dude coming up to us. Great. He gets out and is redneck as hell and definitely not friendly looking. No judgment on the redneck park. I come from a poorer country, from our city, and those are my people, but hopefully that sets a picture. At some point I walk towards him to put myself between them. He looks at the girls and me, saying can he have help? I say no. We're just waiting for the assistance vehicle and we've got it covered. He then says maybe he could stay and wait, so I don't have to. I tell him we're happy to stay and it's good. he kind of just stood there for a while staring at us. He didn't really say anything, just gives me creepy vibes. After what feels like an eternity, another car drove past us and kept on going. This startles him. He mumbles something and rushes off to his car. We waited with this woman for another 90 minutes and see him multiple times just driving past. The vehicle assistant guy finally arrives. I asked to see his ID to be safe and everything's good. She was really grateful and texted me thanking me later for staying with her. The thing I didn't like about this was how the guy had come back multiple times after being told to go away. Even if he was being nice, he would have had common sense to know that he has to leave, but clearly he had different intentions. Somebody actually got kidnapped from the same area months later. I'm just glad I was there to hopefully prevent this from happening. During the summer when I was a kid, I used to stay with my grandma for several days at a time. One week when I was 12, it was just my grandma and I in her home for 5 days. She owns a small handgun. The whole family knows she's not afraid to use it when push comes to shove. So one night, we both went to bed earlier than usual at about 11 PM. I woke up very early since there was no alarm clock in my room. I pulled the blinds looking out of the window, which was right next to me, to see what time of day it is. Now it's very dark. It was a rural town, so there's no cars, neighbours or streetlights. So I guessed that it's somewhere between 2 and 4 AM. A few seconds after I closed the blinds, I heard a deep male voice whisper, "Psst, hey, you." I knew that the voice came from outside the window. The room I slept in was on the opposite end of the house as my grandma's room. But since her house is pretty small, she could have heard me and woken up if I yelled. However, I was paralyzed with fear. I was actually able to convince myself that it did not happen by telling myself, "Oh, you were half asleep. It's probably your imagination." And sat still in my bed for an hour staring at the door. I was, however, eventually able to fall asleep and had a nightmare of a man running into my room. I immediately woke up. It was dawn, and I had gathered up enough courage to run to my grandma's room. We looked around the house for a short amount of time, and we judged that the man was long gone, and I went back to bed and woke up a few hours later. My mum was talking to my grandma in the living room, ready to take me home because it was my last day. When I walked into the room, my grandma told me what she saw on the news before I wake up again. A convict was being transported to a new prison and had escaped from the transport less than a mile from the home. At the time, I was 10 years old and lived in a small coastal town in Newfoundland that was littered with large forests. At the time, every house there literally had acres and acres of forestry behind it, which in itself is very beautiful. I'm now 21, live in a bustling city in Alberta. I do find myself missing this setting in my old backyard every once in a while, but it's usually accompanied by unsettling memories of what I'm about to recount. By the time I was in grade 4, I was already trusted to be home alone by myself, as my mother went out to visit my grandmother and aunt, who lived literally only a few minutes down the road from us. I was happy to have such privilege. I was an only child, and my father worked in another province for months at a time, so I was very lucky to have this opportunity. It usually meant late night movies and video gaming, and the odd bit of forest exploring. This night I was exploring said woods. I usually never went too far in. Usually up a large rock formation, I like to climb and look through the trees in all directions. The house was always in sight, so I never felt frightened or scared being there. It felt like my own private place I could enjoy. So as I was scaling the rocks to sit in my usual position, I suddenly heard a sound from further in. It wasn't natural at all. Crying. Fake crying sounding like a child, maybe even an infant relentlessly crying. I was more puzzled than scared, since crying is the last thing that I expected to hear in the forest. I must have listened to it for a good few times, convinced my ears are playing tricks on me. But no, in fact, this is crying. In my mind, I imagined it's a young girl that somehow wandered too far into the forest needing help. I considered going back to the home and calling my mother to help, but though I'm worried the girl's going to be beyond earshot, I decide to locate her on my own. Now, I made my way hastily through the trees and branches trying to figure out the exact destination the girl was crying in. It definitely wasn't as easy as I thought. It's a matter of trial and error to make sure I was going in the right direction. One thing I never realised while doing this is just how consistent the crying is, literally non-stop. What I did notice was that the closer I get to the sound, the more metallic it sounded to me. I eventually reach a small clearing with some trees and bushes on either side and nothing else. I had never gone this far in before, so this was the first time I'd ever seen it. When I made my way in, it didn't take that long for me to find the source of the sound. A grey tape recorder, one of the biggest I'd ever seen. I was peeking out, looking around and see no one. I now see the crying sounds coming out of the speakers. This really disturbed me, as I went all the way in expecting a real person, not a tape recorder. I was about to shut it off when I hear another sound coming from outside. It sounds as though footsteps are advancing in my direction. It only took a tall shadowy figure coming at me to make me shoot out of there. I was worried I wouldn't find my way back, but fortunately, by some miracle, I recognised my way back by identifying rocks and trees as landmarks. Looking back, this would have saved my life. I never looked back. I just kept going. I can tell that I'm being followed for the first part of this. I just kept telling myself I have to make it home no matter what. Once I saw a large rock formation, it didn't take me long to know the rest of the way without seeing the surroundings. I was out of the forest in record time and immediately ran to my home, locking and shutting the door. I didn't want this person to know where I lived, or I would have been done for. After shutting the curtains at my window, I peek out through them as discreetly as I can. I can't see anyone and I wait there for a good hour. It eventually gets dark. After this I go straight to bed. I never told my mum about what happened and I never went to them woods again. I took a gap semester a couple of years ago and decided that I should take a road trip with a buddy who was also taking a semester off from school. We are from the Midwest and planned our trip to take a big circle from Ohio to LA up to Portland and then back home. We're outdoorsy guys, so we knew we were trying to hit some wilderness along the way. So we're about a month into the trip and leaving Portland, where we were taking a break from camping every night while on the road, itching to get back on the road and into the wilderness. My buddy finds a hike that looks interesting. It was an abandoned railroad about 2 miles east of Portland. He had found the GPS coordinates on some site and said it was meant to be really cool with a couple of tunnels and a massive test bridge. Sounds cool, I'm in. So I drive my Volvo station wagon towards the coordinates. If you've never been to Oregon, it's beautiful. Foggy, never-ending views like thick pine forests. The type of place that you can barely see 20 feet in any direction because how dense the trees are. For the last hour or so of this 2-hour drive, we are driving on logging roads. Haven't passed a single car or seen any life since turning off a rural highway. It's creepy. Endless dark forest for hours. Stop. I hit the brakes. My buddy is squinting at his phone. Looks like we're at the coordinate. I pull to the side of the one lane and park. Dense trees surround us. I can see up ahead that there's a linear gap in a canopy. I guess that's a railroad. We hop out of the car and I unload my day pack with my camera, headlamp, water, and pepper spray and knife. After a second thought, I put the knife in my pocket. The railroad has been abandoned for 50 years. This means that while you can still see the tracks while standing on them, thick brush has filled the entire swath that is typically cleared on either side of the tracks. This has been nearly filled in, except for a foot-wide path that has been maintained by deer, bear, and elk. And maybe some humans. I notice my buddy is also looking at a private property sign that's fading into a nearby tree. He looks at me, and I shrug. We begin walking. The tracks are dead straight. This means that we can see a couple of 100 yards down the center of this green tunnel of vegetation. It's as I'm in a very narrow alleyway that never ends. I can hardly see 10 feet in front of me too. It's winding a bit. Now honestly, it's a boring hike considering there's no view and it's dead straight at times. But we knew the tunnel was up ahead, so we keep going. I keep myself busy, trying to pace my stride with each railroad tie, step after step. We walk about 3 miles away from the car into the woods. Suddenly, I stop though, and my buddy bumps into my backpack. I had just looked up from my feet and was staring into a looming tunnel in front of us, covered in moss, and the entrance surrounded a black hole that went right into a mountainside. Again, we shrug, turn on our headlamps and begin moving again. Graffiti covered what wasn't covered with moss, and moss was covering the other areas. Our headlamps dimly lit walls covered in fairly creepy graffiti. I said eye to eye of a 20-foot mummy. I couldn't see my hand in front of my face, it is so dark. We can't see the end of the tunnel. Drips of water are echoing around us. My buddy and I quickly walk down the tracks. I have my knife out now. I'm relieved to get out. From the exit of the tunnel, I could already see a massive gorge up ahead. The tracks went across a wooden bridge that screamed PNW. It's easy to forget the creepiness of the tunnel, and I looked forward to busting out my camera. Once I set off on the bridge, I realised the danger of crossing something that hadn't been maintained in 50 or so years. The wood was clearly aged, and in some places rotten, but the view is incredible. We balanced on the steel tracks and walked to the centre of the tessile, where we could see a river about 500 feet below. Horrible logins guard the mountainside. I noticed where the boards had been broken, and I hoped nobody fallen. Instead of turning back after getting some good shots, we keep going. The sun was starting to loom at an angle and was blocked by the steep mountains around us. We quickly walk off the bridge and back into our green tunnel. For some reason, I start having second thoughts. I don't know why this come to me now, but I slowed my pace and started thinking, how would I ask my buddy to turn around? Before I was going to turn around and ask Nate, I glanced up ahead at the tracks and stared directly into somebody's eyes 200 yards ahead. I stop in my tracks. I feel a cold rush in my hands and head. The person staring at me has also stopped. I see another man's head poke around. There's two of them. I whisper to Nate. Slowly, we start walking around the tunnel towards the men. As we get closer, I walk faster out of fear. Bouncing off of the guy's chest is a large bush knife. He has filthy clothes, long matted hair, and has not broken eye contact. A revolver is chucked into his pants and he has a hunting rifle with a magazine. At this point, it's too late to run. I realise that my buddy and I are going to have to squeeze by these men on the narrow gap between the tracks. The brush is pulling at my sleeves on either side. How's it going? I nervously ask as I squeeze by them, avoiding eye contact. I count 4 guns in the stench of body odour. I'm unsettled by the way these guys look, and I got a feeling that I've never felt around anyone else before. Then say nothing and push past us. I kept hurrying away, and before I know, they're out of sight again. When I look behind me and past Nate, and we both look at each other. After walking silently for another 10 minutes, we stop. I don't know what to say. I don't know what to do. I don't want to walk in deeper towards the creepy dudes again. Suddenly, loud moaning and shrieking starts coming from the dense woods off to the side. Sounds like it's 100 yards away. It doesn't sound fully human. I know the irony of this. We bolt back towards the cars. I'm not a runner, but we ran over to the bridge through the tunnel and through the endless green that surrounds us. Finally, I see the logging road up ahead where our car is parked. I stop running when I hear a truck idling. I can start to see it through the brush. A big old F-350 lift pickup truck idling behind my car. I now see both the men staring at us, waiting, trying to hide. Nate and I shrug it off and look at each other, trying to act like we're not scared. We jump in, and I stare at the men in my rearview mirror. They have their guns pointing to us. We can't move because that's when they'll attack us in fear. After waiting for what felt like an eternity, we realise the men haven't taken their eyes off us now. We can't back up, given how close they are. I then noticed a fairly solid looking shoulder to the right of my road, and I decided to pull a quick U-turn to get away. So that's what I did. Turned the wheel and floored it. Thankfully my car was able to turn clear of theirs, and we drove as fast as we could down the logging road. We didn't even bother looking behind us. Our dust plume hopefully was enough of a screen for them to not be able to follow us. I drove all the way to Idaho that night, and had my eye on the rearview mirror the whole time.
Sometime around the beginning of July, I got off the bus in Boise, Idaho. When you get off the bus in downtown Boise, you're already near multiple shelters, the skate park, a miles-long bike trail, the library, the zoo, and also the river and woods. It's a really beautiful area, in spite of the overabundance of undesirable characters. The first night I was there, I went from the bus station to the skate park to a place called Piss Alley. At some point, a middle-aged lady pulled up and just randomly started talking to us for no reason. She wasn't a junkie and she had a job, yet she just stood there in Piss Alley and talked to us for an hour about religion and conspiracy. I was really high for the first time in about 10 months. A lot about her made me think she was just some kind of undercover, but I ultimately decided that she was just a little bit crazy. She had a job and a car, and was capable of carrying on an intellectual conversation. We really hit it off, even though we had just met. She asked me if I'd like to go camping with her and one of her girlfriends the next day. She definitely seemed more appealing than the street thug I was talking to, so I agreed to go with them. They were going to be leaving in the afternoon, and so she said I could come with her now, or she could go get me later, after she picked up her friend from work. She took me out to eat, and we hung out at the park until her friend got off work. They made sure they had a tent and sleeping bag for me, and we headed off to their favourite place to camp. Long story short, we went out there, we did camping things, and we had fun and came back. I didn't get chopped up into little pieces, but I also didn't get chopped up. It was about 11 PM when she dropped me back at the Piss Alley. As I was getting out, this tweaker with long dreads approached her car, and he was talking really fast. He said, "I'm not on drugs, I don't have any drugs. I've got a couple of bucks, I need friends, we need a ride. We need a ride across town, and we need a ride real quick." I had barely shut my door by the time he finished his pitch. My lady friend looked like she wanted to give him a ride, but she told him she couldn't. He didn't hesitate to retaliate that he had a couple of bucks, and he just needed a ride real quick. She started beating around the bush, explaining that her car was too full with camping gear. She couldn't even fit them in the car. One of his friends was a girl who looked to be about 15 or 16. He was definitely on drugs. I could tell because, well, so was I. He was starting to reword his pitch for a third time when I interrupted him. Being sure that I had his eye, I bluntly told him, "Hey, no, she can't give you a ride." Then I waved her on, and she pulled away from the curb, leaving him and I looking at each other in the eyes. I could tell he was angry. I knew that in his mind, I had disrespected him. Right away, he fired off, "Who the hell are you? Is that your lady? Are you from around here? Do you know who I am? I'm TK. Everyone around here knows me. You must be brand new around here. You ask some people, they'll tell you. I run it around here." He went on to talk about how no one messes with him, and how he's got everything. He was talking about how he got shooters all over town, and he can just make a call and get someone to show up and kill me. I'm pretty used to people saying stupid stuff like that, and I didn't really act scared or impressed, but I didn't scoff or mock either. I bought 20 bucks worth of dope from him, thinking it might calm him down. He pulled out a big bag of dope. He gave me a tiny piece of dope in the palm of his hand. We stared each other down, and I asked him if he was serious. He yelled at me that what he gave me was all I would need. He was offended that I didn't trust him. A crowd had gathered, all of them staring at me with a look on their face that I knew meant they were waiting for me to make a wrong move. They all had his back. I put my knife on my hand, but ultimately I backed down. I propped the shard into my mouth like a little pill and swallowed it. This was going to end very badly. I was seething. I could glare, but I knew if I expressed my anger with any major outburst, it would result in me getting stomped. TK and his main few friends walked away about 15 yards, and stood talking in a small circle. After a few minutes, that girl came over and started flirting with me. I completely ignored her. This was an obvious trap. If he could make it look like I was disrespecting him further, by so much as talking to a girl or his sister, in front of these people, he could gain more of their support. There were about 20 people in the alley now. I was starting to feel slightly paranoid. That shard was starting to kick in. If I was rude to the girl, that could be just as bad, so I answered a couple of her small talk questions with simple nods. She abruptly quit trying to be cute and walked back over to TK where his friends were, and he was on the phone. Next, a really big guy who might have been about 40, and another guy who might have been about 20 came up to me and started talking to me. The young kid didn't really say anything the entire time. He just stood there with a glazed over look in his eyes, like he was ready to kill. The older guy was a fat, tall man with a red goatee. He talked to me about very mundane things, and went back and forth from being very nice to giving me the same stare that the young guy gave me. I could tell he was trying to see if I was scared, and he was trying to see if I was an undercover cop. He was testing me in all kinds of ways, talking about crimes he committed in the past, and looking at me in a very intimidating, hateful way one second, then neutrally talking about the corner store in a cheerful manner the next second. The two of them talked to me, one on each side of me, with my back to the wall. They were closer to me than they should have been. Everybody else in the alley seemed to be oblivious to us, but there were the guys leaning against the wall at either end of the alley, just staring at us. I had 3 bags, one of which contained my laptop. I had cash on me, and I was wearing a nice leather jacket. I kept my hand on my knife the entire time. I was trying to be respectful, but also not look scared. I was starting to suspect that the shot I'd swallowed was actually bath salt, because on the inside I was tripping. TK walked over and set his bag down next to my bag, and started going through his pocket like he was looking for something in his bag. I was just trying to maintain eye contact with the big guy now. Now I had to make sure he wasn't going to go through my bag too. I knew something was going to happen as soon as it did. I planned on flipping my knife open and sticking him swiftly and repeatedly. If I could, I would try and keep TK between me and the big guy while I stabbed him. I'm good with a knife and can take hits, but if I had to fight now, 3-on-1 would only be the first stage. There would be 3 or 5 more rushing after me. The only thing that saved me is that I casually hinted that I need to go get money from a lady who owed me. Without saying it directly, I led them to believe that I not only have money on me, but I would come back with some, to buy more dope from them. Needless to say, I didn't plan on coming back. The rest of the night was very long, due to the effects of what I still believe were bath salts. I ran through the woods. I kept thinking I was being followed. I hid my bags in different places in the woods, so I could run without them if I had to. I was pretty scared, pretty sure I'd narrowly escaped with my life. I was so high. I came across a guy on the nature trail. He had a cloth bag in his hand, and I asked him what it was. He said it was just something he found on the trail, and then he threw it in the bushes. He was tweaked out like me. He seemed to sympathise as I told him the whole story of what just happened. He was going to take me somewhere safe, a camp where I could lay low. But I was unfamiliar with the area, so we were walking and talking, and the next thing I realised, we're heading right back to the piss alley, and we're about a block away. I yelled at him, and I was like, "What are you doing? I said I didn't want to come back here." He was saying that it was cool, he knew these people, and I was talking about how he could make everything okay by just telling them I was a good guy. I turned around and walked back into the woods. I went back to the area where he threw the bag. I found the bag and opened it. It was something of an adult nature. Randomly stopping to hide, stopping to listen to sounds for extended periods, and to try and figure out where they were. I came across another guy. He was about 20. In the end, he helped me keep safe. He took me to an island, where the river split around a piece of land underneath a bridge. I fell asleep there and woke up in the middle of the night to a random couple putting a blanket over me. I said thanks and went right back to sleep. After a couple of days, I got used to boys. I found out that TK had made national news. The same night I stopped him from getting in Christian lady's car. He convinced a couple of them to let him sleep in their apartment. I can just imagine him telling them, just like he told us, "I'm not on drugs, I don't have any drugs." At some point, he started acting really weird, cracked out. They planned on having their 3-year-old daughter's birthday party later that day, so they told him he had to leave, and he left. But then he came back and stabbed 9 people, 6 kids and 3 adults. One of those kids was a 3-year-old whose party it was. The people he was upset with weren't even there during the party, but he stabbed these kids anyway. He killed a 3-year-old at a birthday party. What a coward. Over the next 5 months, I got more acquainted with boys and this very weird junkie population. The people that had his back that night, most of them still miss him and acted like he never did anything wrong. When I went looking for details in his case, I just found out that he was getting into the needle, but the psychiatric had almost got him off the hook. He won't actually be tried by jury until 2020. That little girl is already dead. He should have been dead 6 months ago, right after it happened, or before it happened. I can't help but wonder that if it was fate that put me in the position that I could have taken him out, but I can't really think of it like that. Yeah, I might have saved that lady from getting in her car, but maybe I was supposed to get rid of him in that confrontation that never really escalated. I knew he was dangerous, I knew he was evil, but all I did was get myself out of the danger, and look what happened. In the future, if I'm ever put in a situation like that, I honestly don't know that I won't consider taking action to be doing the world a favour. What if I failed fate? How am I supposed to sleep now?
My husband and I went camping for the first time ever in Arizona as part of our long trip out west. I had picked out this really cool place. It was on a mountain overlooking a beautiful landscape. It's next to a cliff and in a really isolated location. I'm talking like 20 miles on gravel roads in the middle of a national forest. So, we get there, set up our tent, and hike a little bit and take pictures of the surrounding area. We see a few cars parked around 2 tents and decide to stop and talk to some of the other campers nearby because we heard that there was going to be a bad storm that night. These were 4 guys who are from Arizona telling us not to worry about the storm. That was all persuading. We felt okay and decided to stay. Later on, we were walking a bit further down the campsite. We see a woman there with her dog and another older lady. We smile and wave. We continue to hike down a bit further into the forest. Now let me elaborate that because of the storm, we are one among maybe a total of 7 campers that decide to stay and withstand the night. We watch the sunset when we get back to our campsite. Make sure our car was only a few yards away, getting into our tent when it gets dark. There are no stars out tonight due to the storm clouds, and it hasn't begun to rain yet, so we decide to try and sleep right away so that we could possibly sleep through the storm when it does hit. It's an insanely windy night, so it's hard to sleep, but eventually we get a bit of shut-eye. I wake up at 10:30 to the sound of some crazy thunder rolling through the mountains and rain hitting down on our tent. I'm a little freaked out because they get a lot of flash floods here and I don't want to fall off a cliff. But I tell myself try and sleep and eventually I doze off again. It's 12 AM now and I'm awake again. This time because I hear something heavy hitting the side of our tent. For one, like the sound of somebody punching the side, trying to tear it down. I open my eyes. I can't see anything. It's completely dark. No light whatsoever. The sound continues every couple of minutes and now I'm terrified. Suddenly, I hear footsteps right to the next of my tent. They are slow but steady. I feel my entire body freeze. I'm seriously starting to think about how weird it is and that I'm gonna die. My heart is beating so fast that I am certain that whatever it is out there can hear me. Then, whatever it is lets out a deep sigh right on the opposite side of the tent. I'm thinking it's a bear and realizing that I may actually have to face this thing. So, in a desperate call for my husband's mind-reading powers, I squeeze his hand really hard and he wakes up. Instead of reading my mind, he says, "What's wrong? Why are you squeezing my hand?" Right as he says this, the footsteps stop. I don't hear the footsteps again. So after a while, I break out of my frozen state and tell him what I heard. We decide it may be an animal passing by, but whoever it is hitting our tent continuously every so often. I feel like I'm starting to go a little insane from this night, wondering what's going on. We convince ourselves that it's just pines falling from the trees above and try and sleep again. We just need to make it through one night. Now a couple of minutes go by, and suddenly the tent caves in on my husband's side, right on his head. He whispers that it feels like something's pushing down inside the tent. I feel my heart instantly sink. I'm freaking out, thinking it's a bear that just sat on his head, but he decides to push back. We hear the same sound on the other side that we heard before. We realise it's been snowing outside, and the noise could be heavy ice. We're determined to make it through the night, a little relieved that we think it's just ice and not a bear. We decide to try and make it to sunrise. We kept on a small light that my husband luckily brought with him to calm us down. Things seem to be back to normal. We try and sleep. It's 3 AM now. Not even half an hour goes by that my worst nightmare happens. Out of the pitch black, we hear someone screaming. We both say, "What the hell?" We then hear someone scream out, "No, please stop and help." The way that she screamed doesn't sound like anger, but pure terror. My husband and I are both froze looking at each other. I quickly shut off our light and start panicking, asking what we should do because what's happening? While we're trying to decide what to do, we hear it again. She's screaming no. We then hear a car speed off. At this point, we're in tears. We have no idea what's happening. It's deadly silent now, save from the icy rain hitting our tent. It definitely sounded like she wasn't in the car, but more like she was desperately yelling after being hurt. This is breaking point now, because I could take the bad weather. I could take the possibility of a bear, but not somebody potentially dying out there. We decide to get the hell out of there, and even contemplate leaving our tent and booking it to the car, but we instead tried to stay level-headed and grab our valuables, putting them in the car first. We frantically gather our things, stay close as we shuffle to our car. I close the door and keep the lights off for a while, scared to attract any unwelcome visitors. And while my husband goes back to grab the tent, I call 911. I start the car. I tell them what's happened and they're sending someone to our campsite to make sure everything's okay. Only thing is, we're in literally the middle of nowhere and it will definitely take them more than an hour to get here at least. Not to mention, the storm left those gravel roads in terrible conditions. So my husband and I decide to start driving. It's 3:30 now. As we drive out of the campsite, my husband notices one last eerie detail that stuck with me. The 4 guys that we had talked to earlier had left. All 3 of their cars were gone while their tents remained. Whatever scared them off, they sure left in a hurry. It was only after we started driving that it occurred to me. Whatever was walking next to my tent was not an animal. It's probably someone looking in the dark, lurking for a victim. This terrifies me. I'm not quite sure what went down there. I just hope everyone got out okay.
Back in 2011, I was within a circle of friends that made it tradition to go camping at a certain spot every May long weekend. The spot we chose was in a beautiful area, right on the edge of the large lake, and was located on government land. The lake itself had a dam on it, so during May long, the water levels were always low, if not completely empty, making it possible to walk across it. People were allowed to camp there, as long as they weren't causing any trouble or making a mess, and it was generally a good time for everyone. The spot themselves were spaced far enough apart that you had your own privacy, but not far enough that you couldn't meet other people. In this particular year, our spot was in the middle of a small hill, with one campsite below us and one above us. The first night of our trip happened without incident. During the second day, the people were staying at the site below us had just moved in. We didn't think much of it, and continued drinking throughout the day and into the night. At around midnight, the people at the campsite below us were really out of control. They were yelling and screaming, and their music had gotten even louder. So our friend Ben went down to ask them to turn it down. He was promptly punched in the face, and came back to inform us that he was 9% sure they were on drugs. After that, the vibe wasn't as relaxed, and we were all somewhat on edge. I was feeling really tired, so I just decided to go to bed. Some of my friends were still awake, including Ben, and one couple, Lily and Derek, that were visiting another campsite we'd made friends with that day. I could hear the camp below us still blasting the music and partying pretty hard, but I just tried to ignore it and sleep. I don't know what time it was when I jolted awake. Parts of this are somewhat a blur. All I know is that I sat up straight as soon as I heard the screaming and yelling coming from outside my tent. I quickly ran outside to find a campsite in chaos. One of my friends was clutching their chest. People were running around and screaming to call 911. I was quickly informed what happened. Apparently, not long after I'd gone to bed, the people camping at the site below us decided they weren't finished talking to Ben, and on their way up, they had encountered Lily and Derek walking back. Now Derek and Ben are about the same height and have the same colour hair, so they assumed that Derek was Ben and bottled him and Lily over the head with a full glass bottle. I don't know if it was the same guys that showed up to our campsite, but I was told that everyone else was sitting around the fire when 2 or 3 huge guys appeared from the darkness and walked over to them. One had a paring knife and the other had a butcher's knife in their hand. Ben saw the knives and had gotten up to talk to them, and barely spoken a word when the guy with the paring knife stabbed him once in the chest. At the same time, some people from the campsite above had just seen the guys coming back and down to help. One of them guys, Tim, was coming down the hill when the guy with the butcher's knife ran up to him and stabbed him in the stomach. From there, sheer panic ensued. People called 911, but the ambulance was over half an hour away. This is where I came out of the tent. Tim's wound was bleeding profusely, and he was losing blood too quickly. His friends ended up putting him in the back of his car and speeding off to meet the ambulance halfway. Ben was also bleeding, but his wound wasn't as deep as Tim's, and we were able to keep him calm until the ambulance arrived. The guys with the knives ran off into the darkness, back down to their campsite, and took off in their Land Rover. My boyfriend at the time had got into his car and drove to the entrance to try and flag down the policemen on their way back to the scene. Once they arrived, we were informed to stay in the car, as they had released a K9 search unit to hunt down the people who stabbed their friends. By the end of the night, they had arrested the men. They had tried to flee by driving their vehicle across the lake bed, where they got stuck in a muddy section of the lake. They were on a concoction of several drugs as suspected. Luckily, both Tim and Ben survived, though Tim had lost a lot of blood and took a few weeks to recover from his wounds. Derek and Lily had huge goose heads, and possibly one person had a concussion, but I can't recall. It was definitely the scariest thing that I've ever experienced, and a few of us had to testify against them in court. I just found this sub, and I have quite a few stories. I live in rural western Pennsylvania. There's a mix of everyone out here. Punks, meth heads, potheads, Bible thumpers, all in our area. I'm the kind of guy who wants to help. Just the other day, I stopped some random guy on the highway, looking a little lost. The encounter was more pleasant anyway. Back when I was 16, fresh to the world, I was driving to work, and there was an older lady, grey and confused, looking at the gas station right behind my work. I pulled up and asked if anything was wrong. She was visibly distracted and confused. She started rambling about her kids in the truck. The heat wasn't working. She needed to help them get to their dad. A bunch of stuff. I asked her if she had talked to anyone at the gas station, and that I had pulled over to help her go if she was uncomfortable. She must have taken that as a ticket to get in my car. She opened the door, sat down, and looked at me with a moment of clarity and said, "Drive," as she hit the power locks on the door. I was stunned. Not physically intimidated, but just taken aback by how forceful it was. After a second equal oomph, I said, "Miss, I'm sorry, but get out." She looked at me again and said, "No, drive." I replied again, "Get out my car." With that, she slipped out of intent and went back to her confused rant on the other side of the road. Who knows where the hell she wanted me to drive, but I wasn't cool with going wherever she wanted me to go.
Earlier this year, I went camping. I chose to head to a campground that I often use. It's not far from where I live. Now, since I've had kids, I like to stay reasonably close to them in case anything happens, and also because it's almost empty all the time. I invited a few friends who are supposed to meet up with me for the next couple of days. I arrive at the campground, put $4 in the honor system box and drove to my usual site. I was pleased I had the place to myself. I first walk over to the pit toilets to make sure they had TP, which they did, and then spent about 5 minutes looking at some of the rock formations near the entrance to the site. When I came back, the parking permit that showed I paid for my campsite was gone from under my windscreen wiper and laid in the grill. I think it's strange, but figured it as the wind. After all, I haven't seen any other signs of human life here. I leave the campsite and hike about a mile into the small lake, where swimming and fishing is allowed. I put a line in the water and walked over to the beach. I started to get the feeling that someone's watching me, but wrote it off as paranoia. That was until somebody began throwing rocks at me near the lake. I couldn't see them. Every minute or so, someone would throw one though, making a large splash near me, but there were no giggles or screams like you'd expect. I realised it was most likely one of my friends who I knew, wanting to have some fun with me. It's something we often did, messing around with each other. I immediately hiked back to my van. It was unlocked and would definitely have been too tempting for people not to tamper with. Now I expected everything to be gone or tampered with, but everything's in order. I assumed I had startled whoever opened it up before they could get any of my gear. I locked my van and went back to the lake with my fishing pole. The entire time, I'm aware someone's following me, but I never found them. This let me narrow down my list of suspects to 3 or 4 friends who had the necessary skill to sneak up on me in the woods. I grabbed my pole, heading back, no longer aware of being followed. I assumed my friend got tired of playing with me and would have a surprise for me at the campsite. I was right. Somebody had drawn a smiley face in the dust where I was going to put up my tent. It's both lame, but somehow chilling. I went ahead and set up my tent and got everything ready for the night. At the appropriate time, 11 I'd guess, I announced, right, I'm off to bed, see you tomorrow, so whoever's within an earshot would hear. I bunked down, but I don't fall to sleep. Now sometime later, I hear someone approaching my sight. I even thought to myself that whoever this was needed to work on their stealthy approaches. I hear them shuffling around with my things. I hear they're at the picnic table. They must have been hungry. But I couldn't see anyone because I put up a fly net and it stops the rain too, so it's virtually impossible to see out of. I then heard something being poured and thought to myself, God, they're ruining my coffee. Then I saw a flash and realised that my visitor had used some of the stove fuel to light a campfire. Seemed pretty friendly if they're intruders. Since we're under a burned barn at the time, I knew it had to be my friend who works for the National Forest. No one else knew how to do it. We might be idiots to each other, but we're always law-abiding. I sat up in my tent and said, in the most threatening voice I could muster, I love you like a brother, but when I get out of this tent, you don't have a cooler full of beer with you. I'm gonna bury this hatchet in your face. There was no answer, just silence, and I continued, yeah, there might be some remorse, but it'll be over when you hit the ground. With that, I opened my tent and glared at the figure at the camp chair across the fire. I was expecting to see my buddy. Instead, I see a thin, pale blonde woman. I choke out, what? Just as she shot up then, she darts into the woods. I did what I believed is references noping out of there. I broke camp and drove 20 miles away to a different site. It's weird, but the fact that it's a young woman somehow scared me, not a guy. She could have easily shot me if she is armed, or chosen to. The next day I told my friends, and they were more terrified than I was. I was living in California and had a hobby of backpacking in the Sespe wilderness. I liked the adventure, I suppose. There is everything out there from bear to Mexican cartel drug grows, but I wasn't ready for what I found. The wilderness is huge, over 200,000 acres. You could walk for days and never see anyone. On this trip, I was going out for 3 days. I'm a young man, mid-20s, and I was going with a lifelong friend, Tom, who's in his 40s. I've known him all my life. So one sunny Friday afternoon, we meet up after work and hit the trail. The trip was going well, until the second day had come. Camp is set up and we're hiking along a creek after breakfast. Creeks are nice for hiking because they let you get off the beaten trail, but it's hard to get lost. Anyway, Tom and I are hiking along the creek when we saw a cabin. Not a log cabin, but an almost large shed. Being that we're on public land, we knew it had to be one of the very few forest ranger outposts. When we approach a cabin, we announce ourselves but don't get a reply. We then see a large water reservoir next to the cabin, so we get some water and knock on the door. We walk 2 steps, stand on the small porch and knock on the door. The door swung in when Tom knocked. There was no one home. It was obvious that a ranger did not live here. There's a kitchen area. No one home. There's a Nazi flag and a desk and book. We went in and everything was very clean, but worn. We look around. Tom walked over to a closet near the bed while I snooped through the desk. There were some white power books, Arcanist cookbook, and some other things on the shelves. On the desk I found the most interesting thing of all. It was a double-edged axe head. Engraved on it was, "I was there and not you," and the date is 1983. I showed the axe head to Tom and asked him, "What's in the closet?" and he said nothing but combat figures, a Ziploc bag full of blonde hair. At that time, we knew we had to leave. I turned to the door and held the axe in my hand. I wondered what it meant. I think it's weird too because I have blonde hair. Now, I put it back on the desk. I see what appears to be blood in the corner. It's old dried blood, but definitely blood. Now after camping, we go and make some food. That night, we traded man stories and I climb into my sleeping bag. It's a beautiful night under the stars. In the morning, I wake up. I can feel a weight on my chest. I look down and see a stack of things on my chest. It was my wallet, my ID, and some writing that said, 83, you better run. Needless to say, we got out of there and never come back again. This encounter happened when I was about 12 or 13. And with my best friend who is 3 years younger than me. The town we grew up in was incredibly safe, and it was very unusual for us to ever feel unsafe for the most part. The two of us often hung out in the local park down the street from our home. The park is quite large and open and backed onto an overgrown field and a small little wilderness type area. On this particular day, we were hanging out on top of a giant metal slide which had a great view of the whole park and the field that lied at the back of it. We're sitting there chatting away, and I noticed something in blue along the tree line between the field and wilderness. I notice it move closer and figure it's someone walking a dog, or something in the field. The figure just stands there for a while, not moving, just standing perfectly still. I start getting a little creeped out and point out the person to my friend. She starts yelling at the person, "Hey, Smurf man, we aren't afraid of you," because she's an idiot. Suddenly the figure starts moving towards us, getting closer, moving quite fast now. We freak out and hightail it home as fast as we can. That afternoon, I'm out delivering my newspapers and I walk past the park and can still see a blue figure now in the park, but still far back. It seems like we're being followed. The next day, as I'm preparing my newspapers, I read one article and see someone escaped from prison and attempted to abduct a young girl. He's then described as wearing a blue windbreaker, blue cap, and blue jeans, considered dangerous. A shiver now ran through my entire body because I know that's who was stalking us. I told my mum and she thought I was nuts because the guy had escaped from prison a few towns over, and it seems impossible for him to have travelled that far. She called the police to give the tip anyway. They also seemed skeptical that he'd be out of town. However, a few days later, he's apprehended in a different park in our town trying to abduct another girl. It is by far the creepiest thing that's ever happened to me. I still get awful vibes when I stand in parks on my own. This happened to me over 30 years ago, but I still remember the feeling of fear as though it were yesterday. I was in college, female, and taking a course in outdoor survival. The course ended with a 3-day, 3-night wilderness solo. We were allowed to take a backpack, empty canteen, sleeping bag, knife, 6 matches, rope, a sheet of plastic, clothes, extra stocks, Halzone tablets, small cooking pot and spoon. No forks. We're not allowed to bring food or water since part of our training is identifying edibles and finding a water source. Once I was dropped off, I had to hike to find a spot to set up camp. First I had to place a flag on a tree near my drop-off point so that I could be located 3 days later. Now I'm loving life, just me and nature. I had no fears. Even as night began to fall, I enjoyed the sounds of the woods all around me and didn't mind not having a tent. I built a small fire, had a great feeling of peace. I slept well, but woke up thirsty. My search for water began. Happily, I found a muddy stream, let the water settle in my pot, place the tablets in and boil it. And it had a crappy taste, but at least I'm hydrated now. All went well. I have a great time until my last day. It was early in the afternoon. I clear up my camp, hiking out to my drop-off location. As I sat there, leant up against a tree, I heard the sound of a vehicle off in the distance. I figured that it had to be my pickup. Now as I'm waiting, a vehicle that I've never seen before pulls up in front of me. Immediately I realise that I do not know the man driving. He gives me an odd look. My gut tells me it's bad news. He says, "Hey, what are you doing there? And am I alone?" I then said, "Well, my friends are breaking camp behind me." He then gave me a wink, got into his vehicle and rode off. He then stopped, looked as though he's gonna come around. I didn't bother looking back. I was terrified. I knew I had to hide. I can hear his engine start. I ran into the woods and hid. As I ran, I hear him come past where I was originally standing. I stay quiet and remain hidden. I can hear him calling out to me walking through the brush. I'm so afraid. He says I'm gonna regret this and that he's coming back with more. I hear the car door slam, the engine start and him pull away. Going back to my drop-off point is now not an option, so I began hiking through the woods, hoping I would find base camp. After walking for what felt like hours, I see a forest ranger. I told him who I was and what happened to me. He told me I'd done the right thing because a young girl had been brutally attacked the night before, and the police and forest service had been searching the area. Luckily, he drove me to the base camp where I learnt that another girl in my class had another encounter with that guy, but also ran away. If there's anything to be learned from this, it's sure to always trust your gut and never camp alone. My friends and I decided to go camping one spring break. We had planned a week in advance, and as the day got closer, the weather turns worse. It's cold and grey, unheard of for Kansas. The night finally came along with yet another cold front. It was in the 30s, but we had dressed warm, stocked up on whiskey and beer. The plan was to hit a spot that we knew about. It's barely accessible by a 4x4. We wanted to really camp, none of those designated sites for families and seniors in RVs. We aimed to be very far away from civilization, which was only made up by a single spotlight and a couple of hundred people that drove into the woods. After 30 minutes of bone-rattling dips across dry creek beds and detours around trees, it starts to rain. By the time we find camp, it turns to hell. The spot was marked by an ancient dirt road with a few hundred feet of log-in roads and rotting carcasses. That night, we pass a bottle round, hoping we'd figure out the tents before we're too drunk. Eventually we do, and manage to start a fire with diesel. At this point the hell had stopped, and the empty whiskey bottle lay broken in the fire, and we had a decent pile of empty growing. We drank, played cards, and passed out in our tents. The next morning I gradually regained consciousness to the sound of something large being dragged past my tent. It was what looked to have once been a station wagon, stripped and rust covered, dragging the VW with a chain. The VW had been there for so long that the floor had rotted out, and roots had tied it to the forest floor. They lay scattered in the wake of the wagon. A woman is driving, a man's beside her, and 3 shirtless kids sat in the back where there used to be seats. The man stared out of the window away from us the whole time. The children had dirt smeared on their faces, which illuminates part of them, and you can see their 1,000-mile stares. It's really weird. I don't like it. It's the look of crushing poverty that you've only seen in pictures existing in war-torn countries. The projects in inner cities and deep south. They then start talking to us. You'll come from the city to do some camping. Well, that's fine as long as you ain't doing no drugs. You ain't doing drugs, are ya? No, we aren't. They say just drinking then, hell, I like a drink now and then my darn self. That's fine, that's just... You'll want to know something about here. Have you seen them black helicopters flying around? Then some boys at work for me. This is my land, and they told me that you can't be too careful, so I figured I'd check it out. She then begins laughing. She then says, "You'll know Bethany?" We don't. Everyone knows her. You'll go church. I lie and say yes. She says good. Ain't got no time for those that don't fear God. Why don't you come to the church tomorrow? It's in the basement. You can meet Bethany. It's just over there up the hill. You can't miss it. Boy, sure she'd like to meet you all. They all would. We assure her we would. She drove away into the trees, slowly dragging the VW. As soon as she left, we all look at each other and start laughing. Very nervously, we all have the remnants of a primitive warning system for danger. It's been eroded by living safe and civilized. For every once in a while, you know when something's wrong. I mean, everything about this situation's just wrong. And we're miles away from help. I mean, heck, this is the only person we've seen out here. And we definitely don't want to go into the basement for whatever lied there for us. We decide right then and there to pack up and leave and never come back again. I'm not a park ranger, but I have a terrifying story that happened to me. So it's late spring, heavy rain, it's flooded, and the public hunting grounds are shut, so I decide to go fishing in the shallows with my buddy. We have a great time, don't catch anything, and it's getting dark, so we light a fire to dry off before heading back. As the sunlight is now being swallowed up, we hear something I can only describe as a blood-curdling scream from the distance. It's like a little girl, almost. We think maybe it's frogs. But then we hear twigs snapping, sounding much louder and closer. It could have been maybe 30 feet or less away from us at the tree line. We run out of there and laugh it off. Now fast forward 8 years later, I'm on a lunch break and telling the story to my lead. He pulls up a video on his phone. It's the same scream, but it turned out to be made by a mountain lion. I used to be an avid camper. I live in the Philippines. Now there's one night camping that I'm never gonna forget. The area I was in was supposed to be completely empty but me. That's what the ranger overseeing the site said. So I felt safe going there. I knew nothing was probably gonna happen. I thought, well, the biggest threat I have out here is gonna be humans. Even though I trusted other campers, I never felt safe sleeping with them near. So to my surprise, I see a campfire lit in the distance. I think, well, the least I can do is go and say hello, and maybe go and have a conversation or something, or at least be on good terms and let them know that I'm here in case I startle them. So I go and make my way. As I'm walking there, I don't realise how quick night has fallen. I don't have to worry too much though, because I can still see where my campfire is. As I'm walking, I get this horrible feeling that I simply cannot shake. It's almost as though all of the sounds of the wildlife has come to a complete stop. It kind of looks as though I'm watching a silent film, and something bad's about to happen. I don't know what this is, but I can't shake it. Anyway, I eventually get up to where the campsite should be. I call out hello, how are you doing? And there's no reply back. I think this is odd. I eventually get up onto the hilltop and I can see the fire. I can see everything there. I look around, no signs of life at all. I think that's weird. I decide to leave a little note saying, hey, I'm just the other camper, don't be worried by me. We can have a conversation and maybe go fishing, and write my name and number on a piece of paper. I turn around, and suddenly, all of the sound picks up again. It's so strange. I don't know if it is a lapse in concentration or my mind playing tricks on me, but I don't like it. I go to turn back to see if maybe the person has returned and I'm more focused now. And why he shocks me. I turn back and the tent is in tatters, the whole place looks wrecked, and the campfire looks as though it hasn't been lit for days. My note? Well, that's the only thing I can see. Cindering, sitting just next to the fire, or should I say where the fire was. Needless to say, I sprint all the way back to my campsite. I'm so scared that I hike all the way back to my car. I've never went camping again in that area since. It was March and me and my boyfriend John and 2 others decided to go camping on an island 45 minutes away from the city. The weather wasn't great, but we're seniors in high school and wanted to get away for the weekend to smoke and drink. So we packed 2 tents, firewood, and load into my truck. We arrive at the state park at about 4 PM and set up camp. My boyfriend and I took 1 tent while our friends took the other. So we start hanging around, not doing much. The park ranger told us that besides the other man by himself, we're the only ones there for that night because the weather isn't good. We didn't see any other tents or cars, so we figured that guy's left. I don't quite remember what happened before I fell asleep, but I remember waking up at 1 AM to John getting dressed. I sleepily ask him where he's going. He says to use the bathroom. There's a restroom facility 2 campsites down from us. A few minutes later I hear him yelling in the distance. At this point, I was too tired, cold and lazy to get up. Plus, I'm a small woman. John's bigger, so I wouldn't have been able to help. When he comes back to the tent, he looks a little flustered and says, "Well, I found the other camper. He's a big guy staring at me as I went to pee." I yelled at him and approached him, but he walked away. At that point I'm freaking out a little, but it's 1 AM. I felt safe. I went back to sleep, but was woken at 3 AM by the sound of my truck door slamming. I sent my boyfriend to check it out and he said that the lights are on but nothing's taken. I figured I left the light on by accident and I was just hearing things and go back to sleep. I'm now awoken once again at 5 AM to the sound of cop cars and sirens. The cop rips open our tents and demands that we come outside. All 4 of us are dazed and confused, wondering if someone had reported our drinking. But no, the cops say they receive a 911 call saying the campers at the nearby state parks would be dead and they should send an ambulance. Obviously we're not dead, but they ask if we saw anything. My boyfriend describes the man in the bathroom and the yelling that followed. My friend spoke up and said, "Oh yeah, I heard the yelling." Shortly after that is when John came into our tent to sleep. John looks confused and says, "I never went in your tent last night, I didn't want to freak you out." My friend looked very scared and said, "Yeah you did, you come and laid down and slept with us for like an hour. Then you said you had to go to the car and left." John and I look at each other and say that no, John never actually went into the tent. The cops search the campgrounds but find no evidence of another camper. The ranger then said that the guy had come in and paid his fee in cash, so he couldn't be traced either. So I grew up in a town in a relatively rural part of England. Once upon a time, the whole area had been ancient woodland, but by the time I grew up, it's an urban sprawl met with only a few pockets of woodland, entirely surrounded by housing estates. I used to hate walking through those woods. The quickest way to get anywhere from the street I grew up on was to take a footpath that ran from one end of the street around the houses, and then through maybe a quarter of a mile wide patch of woodland before you get to the heart of the town. It only took a few minutes if you took the most direct path, but my heart would be racing the whole time. I had to walk through there to get to school, or to the shops when my mum sent me to get groceries, and knowing that my older brothers would tell me that the woods are haunted by the ghosts of people who were hung at the gallows that once stood there. When I was a teenager, I became scared of the woods for a different reason though. During the winter months when it was already dark, when I walked home from school, older kids would sometimes lurk in the trees to try and scare the life out of the younger kids, demanding what money they had or even their mobile phones. But I'm an adult now, so when I visited my mum in my hometown last winter, the woods no longer held any fear for me. It had snowed properly for the first time in a few years, and my mum, in typical mum fashion, immediately informed her elderly neighbour that her daughter was visiting and would happily take her dog for a walk so she didn't have to risk the icy pavements. The morning after I arrived back there, I found myself walking down the footpath into the woods with a fat grey, around the muzzle old Labrador in tow. It didn't often snow in the city I live, so I decided to take a recent purchase, a DSLR camera, out with me for some photography. The fat old dog and I wandered around the woods for 20 minutes or so, the dog hobbling a bit in the snow, occasionally making a half-hearted attempt to chase wood pigeons, while I snapped photographs of snow-laden branches and the stark black and white landscape. It was quite early on a Sunday morning, so no one else is around. There are very few other footprints in the snow. I was quite enjoying the walk, but I'd started getting cold and didn't want it to exhaust the neighbour's dog. So I was just about to head back when I hear something moving quickly towards us. Someone was heading rapidly down the main path. The dog and I are currently out of view on the side of the path, but only for a few more seconds. I don't really know why it occurred to me to hide, but I did so without thinking. I hesitated for a moment and then, mindful of memories of being accosted by hooded teenagers and robbed of my very first brick phone, I stepped off to the side of the path and hid among the bushes and trees. The lens on my camera at the time was worth about a month's rent, and I guess I was worried that some opportunist robber would see it and decide it as an easy target. My dog hesitated for a moment as I tugged at his lead, but followed me into the bushes just in time. I crouched down with one hand on his head. I'm now willing him to be quiet as a person came into view on the path just a few feet away. I didn't really get a good look at him, but I saw that it was a man, still wearing a dark jacket and a red baseball cap, moving in a hurry. Thankfully, the dog remains quiet, and then the man's gone. When the man was well out of sight of the dog, I stepped back onto the path and decided to take a few more pictures before leaving. When we finally start heading home, now the near silence of the woods was broken by the loud drone of a helicopter overhead. I couldn't see it clearly until we're on the footpath behind the houses and out from under the trees. But once there, I could see it's a police helicopter and it's circling over the woods. I turned the fat old dog to my mum's neighbour, and I don't have any incident and completely forget about the helicopter until a little later when my mum switched the radio on in her kitchen so that we could listen to some music while we ate lunch. It's a local radio station, and their top news story was that the police were hunting a man who had beaten someone almost to death on the footpath, the same one that we're on. The suspect was described as tall, wearing a red hat and a dark jacket. I saw him fleeing the scene of the crime. It was only my paranoia about my camera that prevented me from meeting him in the middle of the woods, in the middle of nowhere, with literally no one around. This happened a few years back in 2005, when I was around 10, about to turn 11, which would have made my sister 14. We came from a pretty small town in the UK, where not much of interest usually happens. Our main attraction is a local shopping centre. My parents would quite often give us pocket money and let us take the bus into town to go to the cinema located inside the shopping centre on weekends. Being a video game obsessed nerd, it's my ritual at the time to save up money and buy discounted pre-owned games from the game station in the mall. There was something about the build-up and anticipation reading those little booklets I used to have in the game cases on the way back. I'd be off in my own little world, reeling off the facts about the games, or what I'd learnt in gaming magazines, to my poor sister who'd smile and nod, humouring me until we got home and she could escape for a breather while I locked myself in my bedroom for a full weekend of gaming non-stop. A few months prior to this particular trip, she had moved from a run-down council house in a bad part of town to a much newer one closer to where we lived. Between our two neighbourhoods ran a main road with a bus stop near to the underpass where we used to get off the bus on our way back from the shopping centre. We'd then use the underpass across the road, which is surrounded by wooded areas on either side. Before walking the remaining 15 minutes or so from the bus stop to our house. We lived close to the kind of suburban zone where buses stopped only at the entrance to the estate and never actually ventured into the streets where the houses stood, so my grand's house was the closest to the two bus stops. On this day, I followed my sister to the bus, then off it, distracted with the stack of games in my hand, my head in the clouds looking at the screen grabs and the blurbs on the back of the cases as usual. I got the vague sense that my sister was a little tense, but I figured that she's just in a rush to get back home. Now it's worth pointing out that at this time, we're in the middle of a family feud, and my parents aren't on speaking terms with my gran. It's been a while since we had gone to visit her, and my dad had pretty much banned us from seeing her. My sister decides to forego our usual route home via the underpass, and instead leads me towards where our grand's house is located, in the opposite direction of our own. This surprised me, and being an impatient jerk, I question if this is necessary. And why is she taking me to Grand's house when I desperately want to go and play games? She infuriated me further by giving me vague answers like it seems like a good day for a walk or see how she's doing. Thinking back on it now makes a rock sink deep in my stomach, for I told her dad had forbidden it and that I was going to walk the other way back to our home by myself so that she can continue alone. Of course, being the older, street-savvy sister, she wouldn't let me, claiming our parents would be infuriated with her if she let me do so. We keep on walking in the direction of Grand's house, and for the first time, I start to feel uneasy. I notice my sister checking over her shoulder, picking up the pace, telling me to hurry up, and I think it's very weird she keeps on loudly exclaiming how everyone is waiting for us around the corner at Grand's. Eventually, we arrive and Gran's surprised to see us, inviting us in. We have some biscuits and I play with her dog for a while as we wait for our parents to pick us up. Fast forward a month or so later, and the incident is more or less forgotten about by me when our town's first and only case of a missing child hits the news. It was on everyone's lips, and I even remember my parents and my parents' friends joining the search and rescue, scouring the woodland. Tragically, a young boy went missing and was found in the woods shortly after. The whole town was rocked. The main suspect ended up killing himself before the police had a chance to question him. We're all shocked by what had happened. Now, the boy had been abducted while walking through an underpass on his way to school. The underpass is maybe 5 or so stops along from where my sister and I had alligated at. I was dense and didn't connect the dots until much later when my sister confessed to me that she had decided to take the detour to Gran's house after getting an uneasy feeling from some creep sat behind us on the bus who had actually followed us off of the bus and had been watching us as we entered our Gran's house before disappearing. Now, her quick instincts and reactions are probably the reason that I'm alive today.